Vienna, winter of 1987. Outside snow fell in slow, deliberate silence, coating the cobbled streets in a pale shroud, transforming the imperial city into something frozen, timeless, almost unreal. The great Staatsoper stood ablaze against the cold night, its golden lights spilling across the square, pulling the crowds inward, as though the theatre were a beacon in a darkened sea. Tonight, the air was charged with anticipation. Tonight, people had come to witness something unforgettable. Johann Radl, the man the press had once called the Devil's Fingers, was to play his last concert. The violinist whose precision and fire had made critics run out of superlatives was bowing out. This would be his farewell. Inside the auditorium vibrated with expectancy. Women in fur coats leaned forward in their seats, opera glasses clasped tightly in manicured hands. Men whispered in hushed tones, their eyes never straying from the stage. The orchestra sat poised, every bow suspended, every brass mouthpiece kissed by the soft reflection of the stage lights. Then came the rustle. The maestro raised his baton, and Johann Radl walked out. He was smaller than most imagined gaunt, his silver hair untamed, his face pale, but his eyes burning with a light both feverish and unsettling. In his hands, he carried the Guarneri violin that had travelled with him across continents, an instrument said to hold both history and curse in its dark varnish. He did not bow theatrically. He barely acknowledged the audience. He simply raised his violin, brought bow to string, and unleashed the first note. The sound struck the air like a blade. What followed was not merely music, it was something elemental, something that seemed to scrape at the edges of sanity. A concerto, everyone thought they knew, became something warped, elongated, refracted through an unseen prism. Familiar cadences bent strangely, notes stretched until they trembled on the edge of collapse. The music radiated a sense of inevitability, as though dragging its listeners toward a place beyond comprehension. Some said later that it was beautiful beyond endurance. Others swore it felt like listening to a warning, a dirge from another world. For nearly an hour the audience was held hostage. Time dissolved. No one coughed, no program rustled. It was as if every breath in the hall had synchronized with the violin's cry. Then it ended. Silence. So total, so absolute, that for a moment no one remembered applause. Then suddenly the hall erupted cheers, thunderous, clapping, stomping feet. People shouted his name, they begged for an encore. But Johann Radl merely bowed, once curt, his expression unreadable. He turned, vanished behind the curtain, and that was the last time the world saw him alive. Backstage was chaos. Stagehands scurried, musicians packed away instruments, cigarette smoke curled in the narrow corridor. The concert manager knocked on Radl's dressing room door to congratulate him. No answer. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. By 30, worry gnawed. They hammered harder, calling his name. Still silence. At last, someone fetched a crowbar. The lock was smashed. The door swung open. The room inside was a snapshot abandoned mid-breath. The chair was askew as if shoved hastily. The desk lamp burned a weary yellow. A glass of whiskey sat unfinished, the surface still faintly warm. Sheet music lay scattered on the table, yet not ordinary music. Strange notations covered the stave symbols that resembled equations more than melody, as if some hidden code had been buried in the notes. But the man himself gone. No violin. No bow. No trace. The window was sealed from the inside. The door had been locked. No footprints, no signs of struggle. It was as though Johann Radl had evaporated. Word spread like wildfire. Reporters surged to the opera house, flashing bulbs in the snow. Outside, disappointed fans lingered, hoping for a glimpse, a signature, a smile. Instead, they whispered in awe and disbelief. He's disappeared. By dawn, police had cordoned off the dressing room. Detectives combed over every inch, yet the room remained a puzzle box sealed against logic. The only anomaly was small, but it pulsed with unease. Among the cigarette butts in the ashtray, normally filled with Radel's favoured brand, was a different stub. A foreign brand, harsh, produced in Eastern Europe, seldom seen in Vienna. A thread, thin, but undeniable. The first press conference came 2 days later. Cameras clicked like a swarm of insects as the police spokesman delivered his statement. Johann Radel, violinist, was reported missing on the night of December 12, 1987. The investigation is ongoing. At this moment, we cannot comment further. The city of Vienna, a city that had long thrived on its music, fell into a stunned hush. Coffeehouses buzzed with speculation. Was it a kidnapping, a suicide, a hoax? Or more disturbingly, an act of self-erasure so absolute it bordered on the supernatural? Theories bloomed like frost across the city. Meanwhile, in the police archives, Radel's strange sheet music was laid out beneath cold fluorescent light. Detectives stared at the peculiar notations, the cryptic equations masquerading as melody. None of them could read the meaning. None of them understood that the violinist had already left them a trail waiting for someone patient enough or desperate enough to follow. And so began the case that would be whispered about for decades, the vanished violinist. The dressing room remained sealed by yellow tape, the word Polizei glaring like a warning. Yet despite the flood of investigators who had passed through in the days since Johann Radel's disappearance, the space retained a strange stillness, as though it had become a mausoleum. Detective Inspector Karl Brenner stood in the doorway, his hands buried in the pockets of his long wool coat. A man of 52, he carried himself with the weight of too many unanswered questions and too few hours of sleep. His eyes, grey bloodshot, lingered on the violinist's chair, tipped at an odd angle. He had seen crime scenes, both staged and genuine suicides and accidents, even cases where people had seemed to vanish. But this room defied categories. There was no sign of entry, no broken lock, no fingerprints other than Radel's, and yet the man had ceased to exist. Brenner's deputy, a young and ambitious officer named Greta Holtz, flipped through the scattered sheet music on the desk, her brow furrowed. "Look at this," she muttered. The notations stretched across the page in jagged arcs. Some measures contained familiar structures, arpeggios, diminished chords, but they quickly dissolved into symbols, arrows and numbers that belonged less to a concert hall than a mathematics lecture. "It doesn't read like music," she said. Brenner leaned over her shoulder. The scrawls made his eyes ache. "What is it then?" Greta hesitated. "A code, maybe. Or something only he understood." Brenner straightened. "Send copies to the musicology department at the university, and to cryptography if they'll look at it." She nodded. He turned his gaze back to the ashtray. It looked innocuous enough, filled with the curled remnants of burnt tobacco. But one stub stood out, its paper thin, its scent sharp. Brenner pinched it between gloved fingers. "This isn't Austrian," he said. Greta checked her notebook. "Labour ran it this morning. Brand's called Sobrani. Soviet issue, mostly circulated in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Moscow. Hard to find here." Brenner grunted. So someone foreign was in this room. Unless Radel smoked it himself. He shook his head. No. He was particular. Always smoked the same brand. His valet confirmed it. Then we're looking at a visitor. Brenner's jaw tightened. A visitor who vanished as neatly as the violinist. That evening, Brenner returned home late. His apartment overlooked the Danube, though tonight the river was lost beneath fog. He poured himself a glass of schnapps and sat in silence, reviewing the case in his mind. A locked room, a vanished man, a foreign cigarette, and those pages, scribbles that hinted at obsession, perhaps even madness. What gnawed at him most was the atmosphere of that concert. He had not been there himself, but every witness described it the same way Radel's performance had not been merely extraordinary, but unsettling, disturbing. as though the music itself had been a farewell. Brenner scribbled a note in his journal. Did he plan this? Was the performance itself the act? But if so, why leave no trace? Why vanish so completely that it mocked reason? Sleep eluded him that night. The next morning, Greta burst into his office with a folder in hand. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement. So the university sent back their first impressions. She slapped the sheet music copies onto his desk. They say the compositions overlay traditional scales with mathematical ratios. Golden sections, prime numbers. The kind of thing modernists dabble in, but this is extreme. One professor described it as not quite music, not quite mathematics, like instructions. Brenner frowned. Instructions for what? She hesitated. That's the question. His eyes lingered on the spidery handwriting. Instructions. The word rattled inside him. Get me a meeting with that professor, he said. But 2 days later, in the hushed halls of the University of Vienna, Brenner met Professor Leonhardt, a tall, stooped man with wild hair and the look of someone who had stared too long into impossible problems. He spread the sheets across his desk. Your violinist was chasing something, Leonhardt said, voice low, reverent almost. See here the progression, it's recursive. A melody folding into itself endlessly. And here ratios that align with astronomical cycles. Jupiter, Saturn, the lunar month. He was encoding patterns of the cosmos into his score. Brenner's brow furrowed. You're saying this is astrology? Leonhardt shook his head sharply. Not astrology. Structure. Order. He was writing the universe into music. The detective leaned closer. But why? The professor's gaze hardened. Because he believed the violin could be more than an instrument. It could be a vessel. And if I'm reading this correctly, he was composing a passageway. Brenner stared. A passageway to where Leonhardt gave a thin smile. That, Inspector, is what frightens me. The revelation gnawed at Brenner as the investigation widened. Witnesses were interviewed, musicians, stagehands, old acquaintances. All described Johann Radel as brilliant, temperamental, consumed by his art. But one detail emerged repeatedly. In the weeks before his disappearance, Radel had spoken often of silence. How silence was not absence, but presence. How beyond silence there was something else. Some dismissed it as poetic rambling, others as signs of decline. But to Brenner, it sounded like preparation. By Christmas, Vienna buzzed with speculation. Rumors multiplied like snowflakes in the wind. Some said Radel had defected to the east, spirited away by spies under cover of applause. Others claimed he had ended his life, his body, yet to be found. A few whispered something stranger, that he had stepped into his music and never returned. Meanwhile, Greta delivered a new report. Sir, she said, placing a thin file on his desk. Interpol has flagged something. Johann Radel travelled extensively. Paris, Berlin, Prague. But in each city, people recall him visiting libraries, archives. He wasn't just performing, he was collecting. Collecting what? Manuscripts, esoteric scores, old treatises on harmony. One librarian in Prague swears he requested a volume on Pythagorean mathematics. Another in Berlin says he asked about occult writings on sound. Brenner exhaled slowly. The image of the gaunt violinist grew clearer, not just a musician, but a seeker. A man tunneling into the very bones of sound, searching for something beyond applause. And now vanished, leaving behind an equation disguised as melody. One bitter January morning, as snow choked the city once more, Brenner stood again in the opera house. The dressing room had been reopened, the investigation cold, yet he could not stay away. The chair, the lamp, the ashtray, the sheet music, all remained as it had been, frozen in time. He closed his eyes. For a moment he thought he could hear it, the faint ghost of Radel's violin, a note that trembled just beyond perception, a sound that was not sound, a silence that was not empty. His eyes snapped open. On the desk, the scattered papers seemed to shift their notations, aligning in a way he had not noticed before. Like coordinates, like a map. A shiver passed through him. The case was no longer about a missing man. It was about following him. The snow had hardened into grey crusts along the edges of Vienna's streets when Inspector Karl Brenner returned to the university. His boots echoed in the marble halls as he carried the folder of Johann Radel's strange notations under one arm. Professor Leonhardt was waiting for him in a small windowless room cluttered with blackboards. Chalk dust hung in the air like haze. Lines of numbers, diagrams of spirals and fragments of musical staves crowded every surface. Brenner dropped the folder on the desk. "Tell me what you found." The professor adjusted his spectacles, his hands trembling with excitement. "I've spent nights unraveling this," he said. "Your violinist wrote not in melody but in ratios. Look here, each note corresponds not just to pitch but to a sequence of primes. And here the rests, the silences, those are markers intervals calculated to astronomical precision." Brenner frowned. "You already told me he was mixing music with mathematics." "Yes, but it goes deeper. This is not simply a composition. It is an algorithm." The detective's eyes narrowed. An algorithm for what Leonhardt pointed to the blackboard, where arcs of circles overlapped. A location, or at least that's what it appears to be. Coordinates hidden in the score. Brenner leaned closer. The chalk lines resolved into a grid latitude and longitude disguised as harmonic progressions. "Where does it point?" he asked. The professor hesitated. "To the woods outside Salzburg, near the ruins of an abbey St. Emmerich's, a place long abandoned." The room fell silent. Brenner felt the cold crawl across his shoulders. A vanished violinist, a coded composition, a ruined abbey in the snow. It no longer smelled like coincidence. Greta Holtz drove the police car through winding alpine roads, the wipers beating rhythm against falling flakes. Brenner sat beside her, the file open on his lap. "You think he went there?" she asked. He didn't answer at once. His gaze was fixed on the black pines sliding past. "Men like Radel don't vanish into nothing," he said finally. "They vanish into purpose." When they arrived, the abbey was nothing but broken stone and silence. Arches crumbled against the sky. The snow lay thick over the grounds, disturbed only by the prints of deer. Yet as Brenner stepped into the ruins, he felt a pressure as though the air itself were taut with memory. Greta's flashlight beam swept across the nave. A scatter of objects lay against the wall, rusted candelabra shards of glass, an abandoned campfire reduced to ash. And then she saw it. "Sir, over here." In a sheltered alcove shielded from the wind sat a small leather case. Old weathered, its brass clasps tarnished. Brenner knelt. His gloves brushed away frost. He opened the case. Inside lay a violin bow, delicate, its horsehair gleaming faintly in the light. No violin. Only the bow, and beneath it a folded page of Radel's unmistakable notations. Greta's voice was hushed. So he was here. Brenner studied the bow. The wood was worn smooth, but its balance was perfect. A musician's most intimate tool left behind, like a breadcrumb. "Not just here," Brenner said quietly. "He wanted us to find this." Back in Vienna, the discovery ignited a storm. The press feasted on it. The Vanished Violinist's trail headlines screamed. Some speculated he had joined a secret order, others that he had staged his own disappearance for art's sake. Brenner ignored the noise. His focus remained on the page found with the bow. It was another fragment of code more intricate than before. Leonhardt translated it piece by piece, tracing connections between the notes. "This one," he said, "doesn't point to a place. It points to an event." Brenner arched a brow. What kind of event? Leonhardt's hand trembled against the chalkboard. "A performance. A final one. The score marks a date." Brenner leaned forward. When the professor exhaled, 3 weeks from now. The days bled into one another as Brenner dug deeper. He traced Radel's movements across Europe, following a paper trail of ticket stubs, hotel registers, and whispers. Each stop seemed to tighten the Circle Library's archives, forgotten chapels where music manuscripts slept in dust. Radel had not been fleeing. He had been gathering, preparing. One evening, Greta entered his office with a grim expression. "Sir, I think we've uncovered part of his motive." She set a folder before him, photographs of a graveyard headstones tilting beneath snow. One bore the name Clara Radel. His wife Greta said softly. She died 2 years ago. Illness. Witnesses say he was shattered. Barely spoke for months. Brenner studied the photo. The grave was modest, but fresh flowers had been placed there in recent weeks. He was still visiting her. Brenner murmured. Yes. And Sir Greta hesitated. Some of the writings he left behind suggest he believed music could bridge divides between life and death. Brenner closed his eyes. The pieces aligned with terrible clarity. Radel had not been seeking fame. He had been seeking her. 3 weeks dwindled to 2, then 1. The coded date approached like a clock striking midnight. Brenner assembled his team. Surveillance spread across the opera houses, the concert halls, the ruins and chapels Radel had favoured. But the city was wide and time short. Greta confronted him one night as they stood over a map littered with pins. "Sir, we don't even know if he's alive," she said. "We're chasing a ghost." Brenner's voice was low, steady. "Ghost or man, he's planning something, and I intend to be there when it happens." The night came heavy with snow. The city slept, but Brenner did not. He followed the last line of the coded score, a thread woven through ratios and rests, until it resolved into certainty, a location hidden in plain sight. The crypt beneath St. Stephen's Cathedral. Midnight. He descended the stone steps, Greta at his side, their flashlights cutting arcs through the dark. The air was cold damp with centuries. Rows of sarcophagi lined the walls, carved angels staring sightless. And there in the centre of the crypt stood Johann Radel. Alive. His frame was gaunt, his eyes fever-bright. In his hands the violin gleamed its varnish, catching the light like fire. He raised the bow. "Inspector," he whispered, his voice thin as thread. "You've come to witness." The first note pierced the silence like a blade. It shivered through stone and bone, vibrating the very air. Brenner's chest clenched. Greta staggered. The music spiraled, ratios unfolding, primes cascading, silence punctuated with unbearable weight. It was not melody, but geometry. Not performance, but invocation. The crypt seemed to shift. Shadows lengthened. Arches trembled. For a heartbeat, Brenner thought he saw her, a woman's outline, pale, waiting just beyond the reach of light. Clara. Radel's bow carved faster, his face contorted in ecstasy and anguish. The sound rose until it was not sound, but force, pressing against the skull, vibrating marrow. And then silence. The violinist was gone. Only the instrument remained, falling to the stones with a hollow crack. Brenner's flashlight beam shook. Greta clutched his arm, her face white. The crypt was empty. Johann Radel had vanished again. The sound of the violin's final note still lingered in the stone vaults when Inspector Karl Brenner lowered his flashlight. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, almost hostile. Greta Holtz stood beside him, pale and rigid, her hand gripping his sleeve as though to anchor herself to reality. But Johann Radel was gone. The violin lay broken across the crypt floor. One string snapped the bow, splintered where it had struck stone. Brenner crouched, his gloved fingers brushing the fragments. No warmth remained, no trace of the man who only seconds earlier had filled the chamber with music that defied comprehension. He rose slowly, his voice low, deliberate. "Search the crypt." Greta blinked at him. "Sir, there's nowhere he could have gone." then prove it. They moved methodically. Every alcove, every shadow between sarcophagi was illuminated, searched, tapped for hidden passage. The stone was ancient, but unyielding. The walls offered no escape. The iron gate to the stairs had not budged, and yet Riddell was not there. By dawn, St. Stephen's Cathedral was sealed off. Forensics descended with cameras, sensors, and a kind of nervous awe. The case had shifted again from disappearance into impossibility. A technician knelt by the shattered violin. No fingerprints but his own, she reported. And the wood, it's centuries old, not modern craft. Brenner frowned. Centuries? Yes, Inspector. Perhaps 17th century. If authentic, this instrument predates him by generations. The detective's gaze hardened. Get it authenticated. Back in headquarters, Brenner pinned photographs across the corkboard Riddell, in concert. The grave of Clara Riddell, the bow in the abbey, the violin in the crypt. Lines of red thread stitched between them a web of grief and obsession. Greta entered quietly, setting a folder on his desk. Sir, we've located a witness. He lifted his head. Where? A caretaker. He works nights near the cathedral. He claims he heard music last night around midnight. Brenner's brow furrowed. Bring him in. The caretaker was a thin, stooped man, his cap clutched between trembling hands. His voice shook as he spoke. I was sweeping the north corridor, he said, when I heard it. Violin music. Beautiful, but wrong somehow. It made my skin crawl. I thought it was a rehearsal, but no one is allowed in after hours. I followed the sound toward the crypt, but by the time I reached the stairwell, it stopped. Greta leaned forward. Did you see anyone leave? The man shook his head. No, only silence. And then, forgive me, Inspector, but I smelled something. A scent faint but strong enough. Like he hesitated. Like burning resin or incense. Not the kind we use in service. Something older. Brenner studied him. The details fit too well to be invention. A sensory echo of the impossible. Thank you, he said. That will be all. Later that night, Brenner returned alone to the crypt. The city outside was quiet beneath falling snow. Inside the cathedral, breathed with centuries, every creak of wood and groan of stone amplified. He stood where Riddell had played, the silence pressed in heavy absolute. He closed his eyes, replaying the performance in his mind, the ratios, the spirals of sound, the figure of a woman waiting at the edge of sight. Clara. Was it hallucination, projection, or something else? The mathematics of grief turned into invocation. The inspector's hand brushed the stone floor. He felt grooves, tiny scratches, arcs and lines etched not by accident, but by design. He pulled a flashlight close. There carved into the stone was another score. Crude, incomplete, but unmistakably Riddell's hand. Brenner's breath caught. This wasn't just a performance. It was preparation. Professor Leonhardt examined the etching under photographs and rubbings. His expression shifted from wonder to dread. This is unfinished, he said. A fragment of a greater whole. What he played last night was only part of it. Brenner leaned over his shoulder. Then what is the rest? Leonhardt's voice dropped. If I'm correct, Inspector, it is not music as we understand it. It is architecture, acoustic architecture. A design to shape resonance in stone, in flesh, in he swallowed, in memory itself. The inspector's jaw tightened, and if he completes it, Leonhardt looked at him gravely. Then he may attempt to break the final boundary, the one between life and death. The city hummed with speculation. Rumors spread faster than Brenner could contain them. Journalists whispered of the ghost violinist, of a widower's mad quest to call back his dead wife. Religious authorities denounced it as heresy. Musicians argued whether it was genius or madness. But Brenner ignored the noise. His eyes remained fixed on the cold logic of the score. He told Greta, "This isn't finished. He'll surface again. And when he does, it will not be for performance. It will be for culmination." She looked at him uneasily. "Sir, if he's trying to resurrect her, then we need to stop him before he tries again." A week passed. Snow deepened, muffling the city in silence. No sign of Radel. No clue but the crypt's unfinished etching. Then a call. An archivist from Salzburg reported a theft manuscripts missing from the monastery library. Among them, treatises on harmony, medieval chants, and esoteric writings that blurred theology with numerology. Greta read the list aloud. They're all about resonance, the mathematics of sacred sound. Brenner's gut tightened. Radel wasn't improvising. He was constructing. He stared at the map, the red web of pins and threads. His finger rested on Salzburg. That's where he'll go next. They arrived 2 nights later, the snowstorm raging like a curtain between worlds. The monastery loomed against the mountains, its windows dark, its bells silent. Inside, the corridors smelled of damp stone and dust. Candles flickered faintly as though reluctant to burn. And from the chapel below, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of a violin. Greta's eyes widened. Sir Brenner raised a hand. Quiet. They descended the stairs. The sound grew louder, curling through the arches, haunting calculated. In the chapel's centre stood Johann Radel. His back was to them, his bow drawing across strings with precision that shook the air. Around him, chalk markings spread across the floor in geometric patterns, symbols spiralling outward like constellations. At the far edge of the circle, a figure flickered, pale, indistinct, yet human. Clara. Radel's voice broke through the music, raw with grief. Almost. Brenner stepped forward. His voice cut the air like steel. Johann Radel. Stop. The violinist turned his eyes, burning. "You don't understand, Inspector. She's here. She's waiting." His bow rose for the next phrase. Brenner drew his pistol, and the chapel held its breath. End of Part 4, 1500 words. Would you like me to continue directly into Part 5, the confrontation, the tense clash in the monastery chapel, right away? Or do you want me to pause here for a SEO thumbnail package first, like we did with earlier stories? All right, here comes the next chapter, written in the same cinematic investigative cold case tone with about 1500 words. The storm outside howled against the stone monastery, rattling shutters and making the old beams creak like a ship lost at sea. Inside the chapel, however, there was no storm. There was only the relentless voice of the violin. Johann Radel stood at the circle's heart, his bow arms steady, his eyes glazed with a kind of feverish devotion. The chalk diagrams that surrounded him gleamed faintly in the candlelight spirals of numbers, interlocking geometries, notes scrawled in strange sequences. To Brenner, it looked less like music, and more like an equation carved into existence. And at the far edge of the circle, shimmering faintly like breath on glass, the outline of Clara Radel swayed. Inspector Karl Brenner's pistol was raised, his stance firm, though inside he felt the weight of centuries bearing down on his lungs. Greta Holtz stood behind him, wide-eyed, frozen between awe and fear. Johann Brenner said, voice steady, "Put down the violin." The sound did not falter. If anything, it deepened as though the instrument itself resisted interruption. "She's here," Radel whispered, his bow sawing through another phrase. "Do you see her at last after all the silence? The barrier is thinner than a breath." Brenner's finger tightened slightly on the trigger. "I see nothing but shadows." "End this before you damn yourself further." Radel's laugh cracked the air. "You're blind, Inspector. You cling to your logic like a drowning man to driftwood, but some truths lie beyond reason." He struck a sequence, 3 notes descending one sharp rise that made Greta wince as though stabbed by light. The air shimmered. The figure of Clara, sharpened pale skin, flowing hair, eyes closed as though dreaming. Brenner forced his voice louder, drowning his unease. That is not your wife. That is memory bent into shape by grief. Radel's bow froze mid-air. His head turned slowly, his gaze locking onto Brenner. His voice trembled. Do you know what grief is, Inspector? It is mathematics carved into the soul. Ratios of absence. Equations of silence. I have solved them. He lowered the bow an inch, his knuckles white. And I will not stop. The standoff stretched. The violin hung in balance, the circle glowing faintly, as if waiting for the next command. The candles flickered, guttered their light, bending toward the figure at the edge of the chalk. Greta whispered, "So the pattern. If he finishes what happens, Brenner's eyes never left Radel. Nothing he believes. A pause. Or everything." Then without warning, Radel drew the bow again. The chapel convulsed with sound. The chalk circle flared like iron in fire. The figure of Clara opened her eyes. Greta cried out. Brenner fired. The gunshot cracked through the sacred air, echoing against vaulted stone. The bullet struck the violin, splintering wood, snapping strings. The sound cut off like a throat silenced. Radel staggered back, clutching the broken instrument to his chest, his face twisted in anguish. The shimmering figure wavered, blurred, dissolved into nothing. No, his scream tore from somewhere primal. You killed her again. He fell to his knees, sobbing, his arms wrapped around the shattered violin as though it were Clara herself. The chapel went still. Only the storm outside remained rattling faintly at the world beyond. Brenner lowered the pistol slowly, his chest heaving. Greta stepped forward cautiously, her voice gentle, almost pitying. Johann. It was never her. Only echoes. Only the ghost you built for yourself. Radel looked up, his face streaked with tears. You don't understand. She was here. She looked at me. His words broke into silence. For a long moment he simply sat there, rocking slightly, his hands stroking the broken violin, like a child with a lifeless toy. Then Brenner spoke cold and unyielding. Johann Radel, you are under arrest. And the monastery bells rang in the morning as they escorted him out. Snow still fell soft and endless, blanketing the mountains in silence. Radel did not resist. His gaze remained fixed on the instrument in his lap, the fragments bound carefully, as though to preserve some fragile corpse. In the back of the police car, he whispered almost tenderly, I'll finish it. One day, she'll come back. Nothing you do will stop it. Greta shivered. Brenner said nothing. Back in Vienna, the case consumed the city. Newspapers devoured the story branding Radel the resurrection violinist. Some painted him as a madman, others as a visionary who had glimpsed the other side. Photographs of the chalk diagrams appeared in tabloid speculation, mounting about what he had nearly accomplished. Professor Leonhardt reviewed them grimly. This was not mere music. It was a lattice, a framework for resonance that the human body was never meant to endure. Brenner stood at the window smoking. His voice was flat, and yet he made us believe for a moment that it could work. B.C. Radel was held in isolation. His interviews alternated between silence and raving. At times he wept quietly for Clara. At others he spoke of completing the sequence, scribbling fragments of notation on scraps of paper before tearing them apart in despair. Greta visited once against Brenner's orders. She asked him, if you could see her again, only for a moment, would you still choose this path? Radel's eyes, hollow, yet burning, met hers. For a single breath of her voice, I would burn the world. The violin fragments were locked in evidence storage, but late one night, Brenner returned alone to examine them. He turned the wood over in his hands, tracing the grain, the burn marks from his bullet. It was only wood. And yet as he set it down, he thought he heard something faint, a vibration almost imperceptible, as though the strings remembered. He lit another cigarette and whispered into the silence, "You're gone, Clara. Let him go too." The room gave no answer. The case file closed with cold precision. Johann Radel arrested on charges of theft, desecration, attempted fraud, and mental instability. The chalk etchings destroyed. The monastery cleansed, blessed, locked away. And yet somewhere in the back of Brenner's mind, the music lingered. Not the beauty of the performance, but the terror of possibility. Because for one instant in that chapel before the gunshot, he had seen her too, and he could never unsee it. The courtroom in Vienna was no ordinary hall of justice. It was a theatre. Marble columns stood like sentinels, chandeliers blazed overhead, and every seat of the public gallery was filled. Reporters scribbled furiously, their ink running to keep up with the storm that was Johann Radel. At the centre sat the man himself, shackled at the wrists, clad in a plain grey suit. He looked neither monstrous nor pitiable, simply hollow. His eyes were fixed not on the judge nor the jury, but on the violin fragments displayed in a sealed glass case at the front of the court. Inspector Karl Brenner sat nearby, hands folded tightly, his presence a reminder that this was not merely a legal trial, it was a reckoning. Greta Holtz hovered at his side, her notebook ready, her face pale. The prosecution's case was brutal in its clarity: theft of relics from the monastery, desecration of sacred ground, psychological manipulation of apprentices, and endangerment of lives with occult experiments. But the defense, that was where the theatre lay. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Radel's lawyer began, his voice rich with conviction. My client is not a criminal. He is a visionary, a man who sought not profit, not violence, but love. What crime is there in grieving a wife, in chasing the hope that she might even for a breath return to him? A murmur swept the gallery. Some nodded, some scoffed. The prosecutor rose sharply. This is not love, it is madness weaponized. He endangered lives, he desecrated holy ground, but then Radel himself stood. Shackled though he was, the room fell silent, as though the air leaned toward him. Do you not hear? He asked softly. Even now the silence sings. My wife's voice. It lingers just beyond the veil. You may laugh, you may condemn, but you cannot unhear what happened that night. His words carried a strange weight. Even Brenner, hardened as he was, felt the echo of the chapel press against him. Witnesses were called. The monks of St. Florian described the broken circle, the stolen manuscripts, the desecrated chapel. Their words dripped with outrage. Greta was summoned next. She spoke carefully, her hands trembling. I saw him summon something, she admitted. A figure, a presence. It looked like his wife. But I also know grief can trick the mind. What I saw may not have been real. The prosecutor seized on this uncertainty. So you testify, Miss Holtz, that what you saw was not fact, but illusion. Greta hesitated. Yes and no. When Brenner took the stand, silence swept the chamber. Inspector, the prosecutor asked, tell us plainly, did Johann Radel conjure the dead? Brenner's jaw tightened. His cigarette-stained voice was low, steady. He conjured belief. And belief is the most dangerous ghost of all. The jury scribbled, brows furrowed. Days passed. The trial became a circus. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered. Some carried placards demanding Radel's punishment. Others sang hymns declaring him a prophet of new life. Inside, the tension thickened. Experts in acoustics testified that his musical structures could alter brainwaves, induce visions, warp perception. Psychologists argued he suffered from delusions driven by grief into obsession. But still the question lingered unspoken yet alive in every corner of the room. What if it had worked? On the fourth day, Radel spoke again. His voice shook, not with fear, but with conviction. I have been painted as a monster. But tell me which of you would not give everything to hear the voice of your child, your parent, your lover once more? You bury your dead, you sing hymns, you pray to shadows. I found a way to make the shadow breathe. His eyes burned into the jury. Condemn me if you wish, but you cannot deny what you all secretly long for. The verdict day arrived. Snow fell thick against the courthouse windows, muffling the city in white silence. The foreman rose. On charges of theft, guilty. On charges of desecration, guilty. On charges of fraud, guilty. On charges of endangerment, guilty. On charges of heresy, the court refused to rule. Johann Radel was sentenced to life imprisonment in Stein prison, a fortress of stone where the Danube's fog rolled heavy and the winters never relented. The chamber erupted in noise, half cheers, half cries of outrage. Radel stood motionless, his eyes never leaving the violin fragments in their case. As guards led him away, he whispered so low that only Brenner heard. It is not over. The sequence is incomplete, but one day it will be finished. The weeks after the trial left Vienna divided. To some, Johann Radel was a cautionary tale, the madness of obsession. To others, he was a martyr, a man who had glimpsed the edge of eternity. Rumors spread like wildfire. Secret societies sought to obtain the chalk diagrams. Musicians whispered of forbidden compositions hidden in old archives. And in smoky taverns, there were those who claimed they could still hear the strain of Clara's song in the wind. One evening, Greta visited Brenner at his office. The inspector was hunched over files, cigarette smoke curling around him. "You saw it too, didn't you?" she asked quietly. Brenner did not answer at first. Then he exhaled slowly, staring at the smoke. "Yes." Greta's eyes searched his. Then, "What was it?" Brenner ground his cigarette into the ashtray. His voice was flat. "Something we should never name again." But the story was not finished. For in Stein prison, Johann Radel did not break. He wrote. Day after day, he scratched fragments of notation onto any scrap of paper he could find. Guards confiscated them. Wardens burned them. Yet he wrote again and again as though possessed. And sometimes at night the other inmates swore they heard music drifting through the stone halls, a thin, mournful strain like a voice calling from beyond. Inspector Brenner filed his final report with brutal simplicity: case closed. Subject incarcerated, no further danger. But as he walked home through the snow, the echo of the violin returned to him, faint, persistent. And he wondered not for the first time if prisons could hold music, or ghosts. Stein prison loomed like a fortress abandoned by time, its black towers cutting against the February sky, its walls glistening with damp frost. The Danube, swollen and sluggish, dragged itself past the cliffs beneath the prison, as though even the river wished to escape its shadow. When Johann Radel was delivered there in chains, Vienna seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The man accused of orchestrating disappearances through music was now behind stone thicker than memory, swallowed by a place designed to erase both sound and hope. But the story was not finished, and Karl Brenner knew it. As the iron gates closed with a final groan, the inspector remained standing on the platform, eyes locked on the figure being escorted inward. Radel moved slowly, shoulders narrow beneath his prison coat, a smirk playing on his lips, as though he alone knew the ending of a piece no one else could yet hear. For the guards, Radel was merely another prisoner to be broken by routine, another ghost to be catalogued in Stein's endless ledger. Yet within a week of his arrival, something unsettled began to spread. A night patrolman reported hearing faint strains of a violin rising from the chapel, the kind of fragile melody that hangs on the air long after it should have ended. His superior dismissed it, reminding him no instruments were permitted, no strings or bows allowed within the walls. But then, another guard claimed he too had heard the sound drifting faintly along the corridors, as if following him. By the end of February, prisoners themselves began to whisper of hearing music in their sleep, some waking in a panic, swearing that beneath the violin's wail, there was also a woman's voice, humming like a requiem. The warden, irritated, ordered a thorough search of Radel's cell. No instrument was discovered. Instead, hidden in the lining of his mattress were slips of parchment covered in jagged, frantic notations, fragments of a score written in black charcoal. The sketches were erratic, dissonant, almost violent in their progression. The guards confiscated them, tossing the scraps onto the warden's desk, unsure whether they had uncovered evidence or simply the madness of a man with too much silence around him. Inspector Brenner requested the notes be delivered to him. He studied them late into the night, the small lamp in his office flickering as if struggling to illuminate something that did not wish to be seen. The fragments suggested a melody that pulled toward resolution, but refused to arrive, like a door perpetually left ajar. Musicologists later confirmed the scribbles resembled no known composition, but there was structure and unfinished architecture of sound that implied intention. It was as if Radel was still composing from within the prison, still writing toward an audience no one could name. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the music was a message, a confession, or simply the unraveling of a mind caged too tightly. And then came the chapel incident. One evening, a priest conducting a prayer session with prisoners halted suddenly, pale and shaken. He insisted that while the men knelt, he heard a violin playing from the rafters, though every inmate remained still. Some of the prisoners laughed, others muttered prayers. The sound, the priest said, was not beautiful, but unbearable, filled with a sorrow that scraped at the nerves. His testimony carried weight, and for the first time, the prison administration acknowledged something strange was occurring. Brenner visited Stein soon after. The corridors were damp, the air filled with the metallic tang of rust and stone. He found Radel in the exercise yard alone, watching pigeons circle above the wall. The prisoner turned as Brenner approached, his eyes bright with a strange amusement. "Inspector," he said, his voice calm, almost kind. "Do you hear it yet?" Brenner asked him what he meant. Radel only smiled. "The score. It's not finished. You'll know when it is." That night, a guard assigned to patrol near Radel's cell collapsed, clutching his ears. He swore the music had grown deafening, though others nearby heard nothing. When they carried him to the infirmary, he begged them to stop the woman's voice, to silence her before she finished the song. His testimony was dismissed as hysteria, but his hands continued to tremble for days afterward, as though the strings of some invisible instrument still vibrated against his skin. The prison warden considered transferring Radel into solitary confinement, but it seemed pointless. The music, if it was real, was not bound to walls. Instead, Brenner began to suspect Radel was orchestrating something more elaborate, something that required no violin, no bow. Each scrap of notation, each whispered report, felt like a piece of a larger performance, one whose stage was not the prison, but the minds of those trapped inside it. Whether through psychological manipulation, coded music, or some performance only, he could hear Johann Radel remained in control. By March, rumors of Stein's haunted halls spread beyond the prison. Families visiting inmates whispered of footsteps in the chapel, of humming that followed them through the gates. Even the clergy assigned to minister to prisoners admitted unease, claiming their prayers seemed swallowed whole by the stone. The question lingered: was Radel composing in silence, or had his music transcended the need for instruments altogether? Brenner, poring over the confiscated notes once more, could not shake the feeling that he was reading not a score, but instructions, directions toward some hidden act yet to come. Certain sequences repeated like coordinates, certain intervals marked like signals. But to what and to whom they were meant to be delivered, he could not know. And so, with the prisoner secured within walls, meant to hold him for life, Vienna remained unsettled. If Stein was meant to silence Radel, it had failed. The city no longer feared his freedom. It feared the possibility that music itself was his escape, and that his performance was far from over. The winter air around Stein prison carried a silence so heavy, it felt like stone. Yet inside the fortress, silence had long become impossible. By March, the reports were piling on Inspector Karl Brenner's desk, each page written in the hurried hand of weary guards, each repeating the same disturbance music. It did not last long when it came, never a full melody, only fragments, haunting phrases cut short, dissolving in the air, before one could decide whether it was Brahms' Schubert or Johann Radel himself. What terrified the men most was not the sound, but its impossible source. Some swore it drifted from the chapel rafters, though no organ had been played in years. Others said they heard it bleeding through the laundry basement or the corridors of solitary cells where no violin could ever exist. Prisons birthed hallucinations. Brenner knew this. But what unsettled him was memory. He too had heard those notes before decades ago on a warped wax cylinder rescued from Radel's burned flat. The faint hiss of static, then a bow across strings, and then the same silence as if someone had cut the performance short with violence. Now the melody had returned. When Brenner walked the narrow blocks of Stein, he caught another detail. Behind the iron slits of the cells, prisoners mouthed to themselves. Not words, not prayers, but hums low and broken. Each different in pitch, yet eerily aligned in rhythm. The same cursed motif. Radel was still confined in strict isolation. His possessions amounted to nothing more than a cot, a tin plate, and a stub of charcoal. Yet when guards searched, they found scraps of parchment hidden under the mattress. At first glance, the scratches looked like crude attempts at sheet music, crooked notes on imaginary staves. But Brenner, holding them under the dim cell lamp, saw spacing too deliberate to be the product of madness. Notes grouped in threes, then fives, separated by pauses that resembled punctuation. It was not music. It was a code disguised as music. Back in Vienna, Brenner spread the pages across his desk until they resembled the scattered shards of a shattered score. His eyes ached from staring, his frustration rising, until at last he brought them to Professor Erika Weiss, a musicologist whose mind moved along strange corridors of pattern. She examined the scraps without speaking, her thin fingers brushing over the marks. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a reluctant awe. This was no composition. It mimicked notation, but concealed something else beneath. The rests were not musical pauses, but spaces like Morse. The groupings were not measures, but words. He is not writing a symphony, she whispered. He is encrypting information through the mask of one. A week later, another letter arrived from Stein. The warden's words trembled across the page. Whole blocks of prisoners had begun humming in their sleep. They awoke with no memory, but through the night, a phantom choir seemed to rise through stone. Brenner returned to the fortress, his boots echoing in the corridors. He heard it himself this time. Dozens of voices, soft, fragmented, weaving the same motif like a half-forgotten hymn. He felt his throat constrict. The notes on Radel's page had taken on flesh and breath. When he confronted the man, Radel only leaned forward in the shadows of his cell, his smile glinting with teeth. "You cannot silence a score, Inspector," he said. "It finds players. Always." In Vienna, Brenner and Weiss spent nights by lamplight, aligning the fragments. She was the first to realize the patterns corresponded to names when mapped as letters. Certain sequences spelled out initials of prisoners in Stein. A ledger of men reduced to melody. One sequence recurred with unnerving frequency. L.K. Brenner's memory turned and unease coiled through him. Lisbeth Kruger, the violinist who had vanished before the fires, whose body had never surfaced. Her initials hidden in the false music repeated like a refrain. The cipher yielded another layer. Some clusters of notes, when converted to numbers, mapped to coordinates across Vienna. Abandoned theatres, burned tenements, rehearsal spaces swallowed by dust. Each location tied to names in the ledger. It was not only memory, it was geography, a cartography of disappearance. On Brenner's wall pins, spread across a map like drops of blood converging finally on a central point circled twice Stein prison itself. That night, Brenner dreamed of corridors alive with humming doors, each cell a hollow instrument. He woke in sweat only to find another report on his desk. A guard had collapsed unconscious, with charcoal scrawls on his uniform. Not random marks, another cluster of notes, another coordinate. The infection was spreading. Together, Brenner and Weiss returned to Stein, descending into the chapel, its acoustics magnifying even breath. Weiss struck a tuning fork, and the resonance seemed to awaken the stone. But the answering hum did not belong to the building. It seeped from above, from men asleep in their cells, echoing down in unison. Weiss paled. "It is not possession," she whispered. "It is suggestion. He has woven commands into melody. Even silence obeys him." Brenner looked at the pulpit where priests once preached sermons. "Then we must strip it bare," he said. "Find the root of his score before he writes the ending himself." As they turned to leave, the chapel swallowed them in a sudden vibration. A voice, jagged, carried down the corridor. It was Radel, his laugh stretched into a single phrase. "Play on it," commanded, reverberating through the bones of the fortress. Outside, the Danube rolled under the pale moon, indifferent, its waters carrying shadows downstream. Stein prison loomed, its stone walls straining against something they could not hold. Brenner understood then that the true prison was no longer Stein. It was Vienna itself, bound by the unfinished symphony of a man who had made silence impossible. And the cipher they had begun to break was still only half complete. Vienna in late spring carried the illusion of rebirth, cafes alive, with chatter blossoms trembling along the Ringstrasse. But for Inspector Karl Brenner, the city had turned into a map of absences. Pins still dotted his office wall, each marking a place Radel's cipher had whispered into existence. The pattern grew tighter now, like a tightening noose circling neighborhoods, where old theaters rotted behind locked doors and rehearsal halls lay buried beneath soot. Each coordinate drew them closer, not to answers, but to echoes of lives erased. And still, the music followed him. At night, Brenner caught himself humming fragments, his lips moving unconsciously, as though pulled into orbit around an invisible sun. He would stop startled, but the silence that followed was worse, like pulling free of a gravity that promised no escape. When he confided this to Professor Weiss, she studied him with careful dread. "You are not alone," she said. "Several guards at Stein reported the same. Compulsion. It begins as humming. Then it becomes dreams." Her hand trembled slightly as she passed him a folded page. Inside was another deciphered fragment. This one did not contain coordinates or names. It contained a phrase spelled through rests and intervals. "The ledger is incomplete." The meaning chilled Brenner. If Radel's false score had catalogued names, initials, and places, then the ledger was not history. It was ongoing. Additions were still being made. The cipher was alive. Weiss proposed a test. She brought the scraps of notation to a chamber ensemble she trusted under strict secrecy. They played only a fragment, a few measures at most. The effect was immediate. One violinist faltered, claiming she saw a shadow in the corner of the room. Another broke into tears without understanding why. The performance collapsed before it had begun, yet the silence that followed pulsed like an aftershock. Weiss ended the experiment at once, but the lesson was clear. Even incomplete, the cipher was performative. The music did not need an audience to exist. It summoned one. Back at Stein, Radel remained unbroken. When Brenner entered his cell, the prisoner greeted him with a mocking bow, as though welcoming him to a stage. "Have you seen them yet?" he asked. "The ones who hum in their sleep, the ones who write without knowing their hand moves. They are the true orchestra. I only gave them the key." Brenner slammed the scraps of coded notation against the bars. "What ledger are you building? Whose names are these?" But Radel only leaned back, eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You already know. Some are dead, some are waiting, and some are yet to disappear." The days thickened with unease. More reports arrived, prisoners scribbling symbols across walls with their own bloodguards, waking with notes etched into the dust of their boots, entire blocks murmuring through the night in fractured harmony. One message emerged repeatedly embedded in the cipher, like a refrain: completion demands sacrifice. Brenner's investigation into Lisbeth Kruger deepened. Her initials haunted the cipher, appearing more frequently than any other. He traced her last known performances, her name in fading programs, her flat abandoned after the fires. Yet in an old rehearsal hall buried under soot, he found something that made the air still a violin case, charred but intact, with initials carved faintly into the wood. LK. It was not evidence of survival, but of erasure delayed. Someone had preserved the relic as if waiting for the ledger to claim her name in full. Professor Weiss began piecing together another layer of the code. She noticed that when certain sequences overlapped, they produced not only coordinates, but dates. Future dates. Events yet to happen. One sequence aligned with an upcoming midsummer festival in Vienna, an open-air concert where hundreds would gather. The cipher suggested that night would not end with applause. Brenner felt the walls closing. He returned once more to Stein, descending into the chapel with its hollow resonance. Radl was there, not in body, but in sound. From his cell he had sent forth a hum, and the prisoners carried it, echoing through the corridors until the whole fortress seemed to breathe. Standing beneath the vaulted ceiling, Brenner whispered to Weiss, "This isn't a prison anymore. It's an instrument." Radl's words echoed later that night in Brenner's memory, crawling through his mind like a splinter. You cannot silence a score. It finds players. Always. In the inspector's office, the pins on the map seemed to tremble under the lamplight. The convergence pointed unmistakably toward the midsummer date, the gathering crowd, the orchestra that would soon take the stage. And in the silence between Brenner's own heartbeats, he thought he heard it, the unfinished melody, waiting for its final note. The night of the Midsummer Festival arrived with deceptive beauty. Vienna seemed to glow, every boulevard illuminated by lanterns, every square alive with anticipation. Crowds swelled beneath the great stage in the Stadtpark, where banners hung in the summer air, and musicians tuned their instruments under golden light. To any outsider, it was a city in celebration. But to Inspector Karl Brenner, it was a city waiting for an executioner's cue. He stood at the edge of the park, plainclothes eyes sweeping over the audience. Families spread picnic blankets. Children laughed with candied apples. Couples leaned together against the hum of anticipation. Yet beneath the chatter, he could feel the pull of the cipher's rhythm. It was not sound not yet, but presence, a pressure gathering in the atmosphere, invisible, but undeniable. Professor Weiss had warned him, if the sequence aligns tonight, the performance itself may be irrelevant. The cipher requires proximity, numbers, resonance. A crowd is an instrument. Her words rattled in his skull as he moved through the festival, one hand brushing the pistol concealed beneath his jacket, the other gripping the folded notations that had consumed his nights. Then he saw it. On the stage, among the musicians taking their seats, one chair stood empty. A violinist's chair. For Brenner, the absence was louder than any note. He imagined Lisbeth Kruger's initials carved into a charred violin case, waiting. The ledger unfinished. A space left open. The conductor raised his baton. Silence swept across the crowd. The first note struck. It was harmless, a bright overture echoing into the summer night. Yet Brenner's body tensed. He recognized intervals, fragments, the cipher weaving itself into the music, hidden like a shadow behind sunlight. He scanned the players. None looked aware. They were not conspirators. They were vessels. Somewhere behind him, a woman began humming. Then a man beside her joined. Within moments, the sound spread low, unconscious, hundreds of voices, layering a droning undertone beneath the orchestra. Brenner's chest tightened. It was the same hum that haunted Stein, now released into the open air, amplified by thousands. He pushed forward through the crowd, heart-pounding eyes fixed on the stage. There among the shadows of the musicians, He saw him. Emil Radl, dressed in plain dark clothes, seated where no one should have been, his bow gliding across a stolen violin. Guards at Stein had reported him locked in his cell, and yet here he was, conjured, or released, his face lit by stage light like a mask of triumph. Weiss's voice came back to him. Completion demands sacrifice. Brenner understood too late. The cipher was not a code alone. It was an invocation, a machine of sound and presence, and the festival was its perfect stage. The air throbbed now, the hum deepening, synchronizing with the orchestra, until the crowd itself seemed no longer human, but a single vast instrument resonating to an unseen hand. On the stage, Radel's bow snapped. The string wailed a final note that sliced through the night, and then silence. Not peace, but the kind of silence that falls before collapse. Brenner felt it like a weight pressing on his lungs. Around him, the crowd shuddered as one body. Some swayed eyes rolled back, others clutched their heads, mouths moving without sound. Brenner surged forward, shoving past collapsing bodies, mounting the edge of the stage. His pistol rose, his voice cracked against the tide. "Radel!" he roared, but the figure only turned smiling. And then, as though the city itself exhaled, the figure dissolved, whether illusion double or ghost Brenner could not tell. The chair sat empty. The violin clattered to the floor. The orchestra halted in confusion. The hum died away, leaving only gasps, and the rustle of thousands recovering from an invisible seizure. But in Brenner's hands, the violin buzzed faintly, as though alive. On its wood, scratched into the varnish, were fresh initials, LK. The ledger had claimed its final name. That night, Vienna staggered home in silence, unaware of what had been summoned or what had been prevented. Brenner stood alone on the stage, long after the crowd dispersed, the violin heavy in his hands. Professor Weiss joined him, pale, shaken. "It didn't complete," she whispered. The sacrifice was interrupted. Brenner looked down at the instrument. The initials seemed to burn in the lamplight. He could not tell if Vienna had been spared or if the cipher had simply chosen to wait. The following morning, Vienna looked like a city recovering from an invisible illness. Newspapers avoided the truth, framing the midsummer disruption as a fainting spell brought on by heat and wine. Headings read, "Festival panic, blamed on exhaustion and orchestra triumph, despite incident." To the public, the story would fade, but for Inspector Karl Brenner, the night had carved a scar across his mind. He had carried the violin from the stage, wrapped in his coat, as if shielding it from the eyes of others. Now, in the sterile quiet of his office, it rested on his desk. Sunlight through the blinds painted stripes across its varnished surface. The initials LK were still etched into the wood. Brenner traced them with a trembling finger. Lisbeth Kruger. A ghost who had no grave, no death certificate. A woman whose absence had become an open wound. Professor Weiss arrived with dark circles beneath her eyes, a sheaf of papers clutched to her chest. She said nothing at first, simply staring at the violin as though it might breathe. Finally, she spoke. "He was never there, Karl. Radel's body was in Stein. The guards swear it. I verified it myself this morning." Brenner did not look up. Then who or what was playing last night? Weiss lowered herself into a chair. A shadow. A construct of the cipher itself. It doesn't need Radel in flesh, only his intent. The music carries the will. She hesitated before adding, "And it's unfinished. That's what frightens me most. It stopped before the sacrifice, which means it can resume." The words settled like dust in the air. Brenner felt the weight of inevitability pressing against him. The violin was not an instrument, it was a key, waiting for the right hand to turn. Later that afternoon, he walked the corridors of Stein prison. The walls smelled of stone and iron, heavy with the despair of decades. Emil Radel sat in his cell, pale, unmoving. His eyes, when they lifted, were not those of a man, but of something watching through a man. A faint smile crept onto his lips. You heard them, didn't you? His voice was soft, almost tender, the city humming in its sleep. It will wake again. Brenner clenched his fists. You weren't there. I'm always there, Adele replied. Every stage, every note. You can burn me, bury me, lock me in stone. But sound travels, Inspector. You can't cage resonance. Brenner wanted to strike him, to shake him until something human returned to his face. But he turned and left the prisoner's laughter clinging to him like smoke. That night alone in his apartment, Brenner poured whiskey into a glass and stared at the violin propped in the corner. His city slept outside, the window lights twinkling like fragile stars. He knew the official reports would bury the incident just as they had buried countless other truths. Vienna would continue to dance, drink, and play, and somewhere beneath it all, the cipher would wait. He lifted the violin just once, placing it beneath his chin. The wood vibrated faintly, as if remembering. He drew the bow across the strings. The sound was raw, discordant, but within the broken note, he thought he heard the hum again, low, patient, endless. He dropped the bow and stepped back, his chest tightening. Weiss's words haunted him. It didn't complete. It can resume. In the distance, a church bell tolled midnight. Brenner poured the whiskey down the drain, gripping the window frame until his knuckles whitened. He knew then that this was no victory. The Midsummer Festival had not closed the case, it had opened it wider. Vienna was not safe. It was merely waiting. 3 days after the Midsummer Festival, Vienna wore its mask of normalcy well. Tourists filled the coffee houses, carriages rattled across the cobblestones, and the Philharmonic rehearsed Beethoven with the confidence of a city that believed itself immortal. Yet beneath the surface, Brenner felt the tension of something unhealed, a splinter lodged too deep to be pulled free. Professor Weiss called him to her office that morning. Her desk was a battlefield of letters, telegrams, and marked maps. She gestured to one folded cable, her expression grim. It's begun elsewhere. The telegram was from Hamburg. At the Staatsoper, an unlisted performance had erupted during a rehearsal. Witnesses claimed a lone violinist appeared on stage playing notes no one recognized, before vanishing as suddenly as he had arrived. The audience, limited to technicians and staff, reported dizziness, fainting, and in one case, temporary blindness. No official record existed, only whispers among stagehands and a coded message from Weiss's contacts. Brenner's jaw tightened. The cipher moved. Weiss nodded. Like a contagion. It doesn't bind itself to geography. Once awakened, it seeks ears' minds' resonance. Think of it as a current running beneath Europe. Vienna was only its first surface. Brenner studied the map pinned to her wall. Red pins dotted cultural centres: Munich, Paris, Prague, Budapest. Lines of string connected them, forming a web that seemed less like geography and more like a score notes on a staff. Hamburg's the opening chord, Weiss murmured. The rest may follow. By evening, they were on a train north. Rain streaked the windows, blurring the green fields into grey watercolour. Brenner sat across from Weiss, the violin case between them, like an unwanted passenger. Neither spoke for long stretches, the rhythm of the train their only companion. Brenner's thoughts circled back to Radel's words. You can't cage resonance. When they arrived in Hamburg, the air smelled of salt and smoke. The harbour pulsed with industry, yet the opera house loomed above it like an ivory relic, a monument to art in a city of commerce. Inside, they met with Herr Dietz, a weary stage manager, whose hands shook as he offered them coffee. I've worked 30 years in this house, Dietz said. I've seen drunks stumble on stage, fires break out in the wings, even a chandelier fall during rehearsal. But this... He shivered. This was different. The music, it wasn't music. It was hunger, shaped into sound. He led them to the stage. The wooden boards creaked beneath their steps. The vast auditorium yawned empty, its gilded balconies watching like silent witnesses. Dietz pointed to the center of the stage. He stood there, thin man, black coat, No face I recognized. Played as if the world would end if he stopped. Brenner crouched, running his fingers over the floorboards. They were scorched, faintly darkened in a circular pattern, as though heat had risen from within. Weiss leaned closer, whispering, "It's the same signature. The cipher leaves traces like burns on the air." Suddenly, a faint note drifted through the rafters. High, piercing. It was not part of any rehearsal, there was no orchestra present. The sound lingered, then dissolved into silence. Dietz went pale. That's it. That's the sound. Brenner's hand instinctively went to the violin case, though it offered no comfort. He felt the weight of inevitability pressing once more. The cipher was not confined to Vienna, nor to Radel's hand. It was moving freely, choosing stages as a predator chooses ground. Weiss turned to him, her face lit by the dim stage lights. "We can't chase it everywhere. If it's traveling through performance halls, it will appear again soon. The question is, where is its crescendo meant to occur?" Brenner looked at the scorched boards, then at the empty balconies above. A thought unwelcome, yet undeniable, took root in his mind. The cipher was not random. It was following a score, and they were only just beginning to read it. As they left the opera house, the harbour fog closed in, muffling the city's clamour. Somewhere beyond the water, a ship's horn moaned a low, resonant sound that reminded Brenner too much of the violin's hum. He tightened his coat against the chill, though the cold came not from the sea, but from the sense that Europe itself was becoming the stage for a performance no one had consented to hear. For the first time since the case began, Brenner allowed himself to think the unthinkable. Perhaps they were not investigators anymore. Perhaps they were merely the audience trapped in a theatre with no exit, waiting for the final act. The journey from Hamburg to Paris took 2 nights. Europe unfurled outside the train windows in restless silence. Forests blurred into plains, plains into industrial towns, where smokestacks punched through clouds. Neither Brenner nor Weiss spoke much. The cipher's spread was no longer theory. It was fact unfolding like a dark symphony across the continent. In Paris, the city did not betray its secrets. Boulevards gleamed with lamps, cafes spilled their noise into the night, and the Seine reflected bridges as though painted in liquid gold. Yet beneath its beauty, Brenner sensed unease. Posters outside the Opera Garnier announced a gala performance scheduled within days, a celebration of French virtuosos, featuring rare manuscripts from forgotten composers. Weiss showed him a clipping from Le Figaro, her finger pressing hard on the ink. Une inédit, retrouvait une partition incomplète, attribuée à un disciple de Tartini, découvert dans les archives du conservatoire. Brenner read it twice. An unfinished manuscript, Weiss's eyes narrowed. The cipher never belonged to Radel. He unearthed it. Now Paris believes it has something older, an earlier vessel. At the conservatoire, they met Madame Fournier, a curator, whose voice trembled even as she insisted she was not afraid. She led them into a locked chamber where the manuscript lay under glass. The paper was brittle ink faded to sepia. Yet even through glass, Brenner felt the pull of it. The way the notes scattered across staves seemed less like music than incantation. It arrived anonymously, Fournier explained. A package with no sender. The handwriting is not that of any known composer, though some claim Tartini's circle. Brenner bent closer. The marks were not uniform. Some notes slanted, unnaturally clustered into shapes that resembled symbols more than notation. It's the same language, he whispered. The cipher reborn. Weiss leaned over his shoulder. Notice the gaps, measures left blank. It's unfinished. Whoever wrote this expected someone else to complete it. For a moment the room felt smaller, the manuscript heavier than its fragile paper allowed. Brenner thought of Radel, of the Hamburg phantom of Vienna's scorched stage. They had not been anomalies. They were preludes. That night, they walked the narrow streets near Montmartre. Fog clung to the stones, dimming the gas lamps. Street musicians played violins and accordions, but to Brenner, every note seemed suspicious, every melody a fragment of something darker. Weiss finally broke their silence. If this is unfinished, then someone is finishing it. Piece by piece, city by city. Vienna gave one fragment, Hamburg another. Paris will attempt the next. Brenner's reply was quiet, almost swallowed by the night. And when the final bar is played, Weiss stopped turning to him. Then Europe won't have an audience. It will have a choir, unwilling, unknowing, bound by sound. The next morning, they returned to the conservatoire, but Fournier was gone. Her office door was locked, her desk abandoned mid-task. A custodian whispered she had left with a man in a dark coat violin case in hand. The manuscript's glass case stood empty. Brenner stared at the void pulse thundering. The theft was not theft, it was continuation. The score was moving again, pulled toward its crescendo. Weiss whispered what both already knew. Next stop is the Garnier. They'll attempt the performance there. Brenner looked at the ornate opera house through the window. Its facade gleamed white in the morning sun statues frozen in triumphant poses. But to him, it resembled less a temple of music than a stage for ritual, ready to host something Paris would never forget, and perhaps never survive. The Opéra Garnier had always been a palace of beauty. Its marble staircases rose like frozen waterfalls. Its chandeliers glittered with captured stars. Its painted ceilings bore mythic scenes of gods and muses. On the night of the gala, however, Brenner felt none of its splendor. Every candle, every echo of heels across the mosaic floors seemed like camouflage for something else, an event that had been designed long before the first ticket was sold. Crowds gathered in silks and tuxedos, laughing too loudly, sipping champagne, as if Paris had never known fear. They spoke of culture, of heritage, of the rare manuscript announced in the press. But beneath their chatter, Brenner felt the tremor of expectation, as though the building itself held its breath. Weiss, dressed in dark evening attire that allowed her to blend among patrons, leaned close. "They will not announce what they play," she whispered. "It will appear simply as a rediscovered piece. The audience will not realize until it is too late." Brenner's eyes swept the grand hall. Somewhere among these gilded balconies and velvet seats, the stolen manuscript waited, pages trembling in anticipation of release. He had heard rumors before: music, as weapon music, as invocation. Tonight he would see it unmasked. They found their seats near the edge of the stalls. From there, Brenner could see the orchestra pit filling, violinists tuning bows, testing strings in restless scratches. Cellists leaned into their instruments. Clarinets breathed tentative notes. Yet amid the usual noise of preparation, there was something unsettling, a melody emerging unbidden, fragmentary, as though the musicians were already caught in a net they didn't realize existed. The conductor entered to applause, tall and severe, his coattails sweeping like a raven's wings. His presence alone seemed to dim the air. He bowed, turned, and raised his baton. The orchestra began with expected overtures, bright, harmless works by French composers, pieces everyone recognized. Brenner noted how the audience relaxed, smiles, softening, applause generous. But Weiss leaned closer, whisper cutting through the music. "They are disarming them. Conditioning. Soon they will slip it in, unnoticed." Half an hour passed before it began. At first it was subtle. The orchestra shifted into a minor key strings, drawing out notes that seemed to scrape against each other. Brenner leaned forward. On the conductor's stand, new pages gleamed. A violin solo emerged, fragile, hesitant, but carrying beneath it a strange cadence, as though whispering syllables no human voice had ever spoken. The soloist, a young woman in white, closed her eyes, bow, gliding across strings as if entranced. Weiss grasped Brenner's hand tightly. This is it. The notes thickened. The orchestra built behind her chords, stacking like walls. The air itself grew heavy. Brenner felt his heart beating slower, dragged into rhythm by the music. He looked around. Audience members were leaning forward, eyes glassy, lips parting as though murmuring along. Not applause, not chatter, just a low hum, unconscious, uncoordinated, yet perfectly in time with the score. The cipher was working. Weiss's voice was strained. They've embedded the text in the rhythm. It bypasses language straight into the body. The music swelled strings writhing like serpents. The brass entered with sudden violence, shattering the calm. Above it all, the soloist's violin screamed a voice caught between beauty and terror. Brenner dug his nails into the seat. Images clawed at his mind fire reflected on cathedral glass rivers running backward, faceless figures assembling in endless ranks. He shook his head, fighting the pull, forcing his gaze onto Weiss as anchor. She leaned in close. If it finishes, if they complete the manuscript, we lose Paris. The conductor's baton snapped downward. A sudden silence fell. The audience held still breaths, caught eyes vacant. Then the orchestra launched into the final movement, the missing fragment of the manuscript now filled with furious invention. It was not performance. It was conjuration. Brenner stood abruptly. We have to stop it. Weiss grabbed his arm. If we intervene without proof, they'll see us as mad. But if we wait too long, her words were drowned by a surge of sound. The walls of Garnier seemed to vibrate, dust falling from gilded angels, chandeliers trembling. The music was no longer confined to instruments, it seemed to pour from the very air, from stone and glass and flesh alike. Brenner stumbled into the aisle, pushing past patrons who sat entranced, their bodies swaying in unison with invisible currents. He reached the pit, vaulting the low barrier. Musicians barely noticed him, their eyes unfocused, bows moving in flawless synchronization. He grabbed the conductor's stand. The manuscript lay open ink, shining unnaturally under stage light, symbols crawling across the page like living things. He tried to tear it free. His hands burned on contact as though the paper resisted him. The conductor turned eyes, black face, expressionless. With a sudden motion, he struck Brenner across the chest with the baton. Brenner fell back, gasping as if struck not by wood, but by something immaterial, a force humming with the resonance of the score. Weiss was beside him instantly. She had drawn a small blade hidden in her evening coat. Without hesitation, she slashed through the air, cutting a diagonal across the manuscript's page. A sound like tearing metal shrieked through the hall. Instruments wailed off key. The audience gasped collectively, some collapsing forward, others screaming. The soloist's bow snapped strings whipping across her face. The conductor staggered, eyes flickering back to human color before rolling white. For a moment, silence threatened to reclaim the hall. Then chaos. Patrons surged for exits, tripping over seats. Musicians dropped instruments as though waking from nightmares. The torn manuscript fluttered its pages, glowing faintly, before disintegrating into ash that vanished in the draft of the panicked crowd. Brenner, still on the floor, felt his lungs burning. Weiss knelt beside him, voice urgent but low. It's not over. That was only one fragment. Whoever orchestrated this has others. Tonight we stopped Paris, but the symphony is still incomplete. Sirens wailed in the distance. Authorities would arrive soon, and with them questions Brenner could not answer. He forced himself upright, scanning the chaos. The conductor's body was gone. No trace, no collapse, as if he had never existed. Weiss steadied him, guiding him toward a side exit. Her words lingered in his mind, even as they stumbled into the cold Paris night. The music wants to be whole. Someone will finish it. And when they do, no city will be large enough to contain it. Brenner looked back once at the glowing windows of Garnier silhouettes of terrified patrons spilling into the street. Paris had been spared, but only narrowly. Somewhere in the darkness, the cipher still moved, hunting for its final stage. And Brenner knew they would have to follow no matter where it led. Snow fell over Prague, like the ash of forgotten fires. It drifted down in silence, catching on the stone gargoyles of St. Vitus Cathedral, on the rusted spires that clawed at the sky, on the endless cobblestones of streets too old to remember their first footsteps. To Brenner, the city felt like an echo chamber, a place that swallowed sound only to return it, amplified, transformed. Weiss had chosen it deliberately. They brought the last fragment, here she said, her breath clouding white. Prague has always been the city of thresholds, alchemy, mysticism, music. It's where people believe stone can sing. Brenner adjusted his coat, eyes fixed on the looming cathedral ahead. And tonight, it will sing death if we don't stop them. For months they had chased the cipher across Europe, from the fog-drenched streets of London to the gilded opera houses of Paris, through archives that burned themselves clean, through train carriages filled with coded scores. Each time they stopped a performance, each time they destroyed a page, the pattern reassembled elsewhere, as if some unseen hand was determined to complete the music. Now at the edge of winter, it had all converged here at St. Vitus, where centuries of sacred resonance waited like dry tinder for a single spark. They approached the cathedral's side entrance. Guards in black coats patrolled, but their movements were sluggish, mechanical. Weiss's eyes narrowed. They've heard the prelude already. The music makes them compliant. She slipped past with practiced ease, Brenner following close behind. The massive oak doors groaned open, and the air within hit him like a wall cold humming alive. Inside the cathedral had been transformed into a stage. The altar was draped in velvet candelabras, casting shadows that bent impossibly long. At the center, a massive stand held the reconstructed manuscript. Pages glowed faintly, script twisting as though freshly inked. Around it, musicians sat in a circle, instruments raised. Their faces were pale eyes, glassy mouths, silently forming syllables that were not prayers. Brenner's stomach tightened. They've assembled the entire symphony. Weiss gripped his wrist. If it completes, it won't be a city this time. It will be Europe. The resonance will travel through every church bell, every train whistle, every instrument tuned to the Western scale. It will not stop. A figure stepped forward from the shadows. Brenner recognized him instantly, though he had no name, only the impression of a presence that had stalked them since London. The conductor. Tall, severe, his baton like a blade of bone. His voice carried effortlessly in the cavernous hall. You have interfered long enough. Do you not see this music is not destruction? It is correction. Humanity has wandered blind and broken. The cipher will bring harmony, unity of rhythm and breath. One voice, one order. Weiss spat the words back at him. You mean annihilation? The conductor smiled faintly. Semantics. He raised the baton. The first notes cracked the silence. They were low, subterranean, as if the earth itself had been turned into a cello string. The cathedral shook. Dust rained from vaulted arches. Brenner felt his pulse falter, aligning itself against his will with the slow, relentless rhythm. Around him, statues of saints seemed to tilt forward, their faces caught in agony or ecstasy he could not tell. Weiss gripped his shoulder. We can't destroy the manuscript this time. It's protected, bound into the cathedral itself. But we can do something else. Remember Vienna. Remember the counterpoint. Brenner's mind snapped back. In Vienna, they had found a fragment of an antidote score music, written centuries earlier, deliberately hidden inside a psalm. It had been incomplete, but Weiss had memorized its shape. If played now, it could fracture the cipher, break the unison, before it reached culmination. But we don't have an orchestra, Brenner whispered. Weiss pulled a small violin case from beneath her coat. She had carried it the entire journey, never explaining why. She opened it now, revealing an instrument scarred, repaired, patched with mismatched wood. We don't need an orchestra, she said. We just need one voice to begin. The conductor's arm cut downward. The full force of the cipher roared to life, violins shrieking, brass blaring, drums pounding like the march of titans. The stained glass windows trembled, colors shifting, as if bleeding into new shapes. Brenner staggered under the pressure of it, ears ringing, vision swimming. But Weiss raised the violin to her chin, bow poised. She began to play. The counterpoint was fragile, hesitant, no more than a thread of melody weaving against the storm. At first, it was swallowed, drowned beneath the symphony's weight. But slowly, impossibly, it gained ground. A second voice in the cathedral, not in harmony, but in defiance. Where the cipher surged, her melody resisted. Where it demanded unity, hers insisted on individuality. Brenner forced himself forward, shielding her from advancing acolytes who moved to silence her. He fought with fists, elbows, desperation, every strike fueled by the knowledge that if she fell, the world followed. The conductor's eyes darkened. He lifted both hands, and the orchestra swelled to violence. Stone cracked pews, splintered flames guttered in impossible winds. Yet Weiss's melody soared higher, piercing through. Her bow snapped, she kept playing with frayed horsehair, every note pulled from the edge of ruin. Brenner saw it then, the manuscript itself faltering. The ink quivered, stuttering across the page. Notes warped, colliding into discord. The cipher screamed. The conductor stumbled, voice breaking into a shout. No, you cannot undo perfection. Weiss's final note was not beautiful. It was raw, jagged, but resolute. The cathedral answered with silence. The manuscript ignited. Pages curled inward, burning without flame, collapsing into black ash. The musicians collapsed with it, instruments clattering to stone. The conductor dropped his baton. For a moment he stood eyes wide with something almost human, fear, regret, loss. Then he dissolved into shadow, vanishing like smoke. The silence after was unbearable. Brenner fell to his knees, chest heaving. Weiss lowered the violin, her hands trembling, eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. It's over, Brenner whispered. But Weiss shook her head. Not over. Interrupted. Music never ends, it only changes form. Someone will find fragments again. But tonight, yes, tonight it's over. They stepped out into the Prague night. Snow still fell soft, indifferent, covering the city, as though nothing had happened. Lights glowed in windows, bells rang faintly in the distance, normal, imperfect human. Brenner turned to Weiss. What? Now. She smiled faintly, exhaustion softening her face. Now we rest, until the next note is struck. The city lay before them, vast and ancient, holding its secrets close. And though the cipher was gone, Brenner felt its echo lingering, a reminder that the world was always one performance away from unraveling. But for tonight at least, the stage was silent.